Thank you. Good morning. My name is Zach Perrone. I'm the General Vice Chair of the IACP PIO section. I'm also a captain with the Palo Alto, California Police Department. I'm just here to introduce our speaker and give you a few reminders. For many of you, this may be your first educational session at the conference. If you got in, hopefully your hotel worked out nicely and your shuttle got you over here easily. We've got a fantastic lineup of classes in the PIO section for the next 2 days. I'd encourage you to use the app if you have not downloaded it already. That kind of takes the place of the printed material that they gave you in your conference bag, as it is the most current and up-to-date schedule of events. A couple reminders. Your feedback after this session is critically important to us because we as PIO section leadership use your feedback to make selections for future year's workshops. So please rate the speaker, please rate the content, the topic, and I want you to know that we read all of that and pay close attention to it. You can rate each session within the app. If you click on the class itself, there's a little sidebar on the left. There's a clipboard icon, and it's like a 5-question thing. You just tap on the number of stars, and it's super easy. So please do that at the conclusion of the class. Also, this session is being recorded. Many of the more popular sessions this conference are being recorded on audio and video, and they'll be posted on the IACP website after the conference in the members-only area. So you'll need your login credentials, but you'll be able to view a number of classes, including this one later on. And the final reminder I'd have is to know that there are many folks in the community and around the world that are following the hashtag IACP 2017, many of whom are anti-law enforcement. And if you're not aware of what's been going on, many folks who have been posting, many of our conference attendees who have been posting photos from the conference in the exhibit hall and things like that, some of these anti-police folks are saving those photos that are posted publicly on social media and reposting them as their own content along with a critical anti-law enforcement message. So the reason I bring that up now is just if you're gonna take photos of some of Julie's slides or anything like that, please just be judicious and think about, okay, if I post this somewhere right now, how could that be used against our profession? So I think largely I talked to Julie and I don't think there's gonna be any problems like that with her presentation, but just so you're aware for the next 2 days. So without further ado, one of our rock stars in the PIO section, if you guys haven't heard her before, she's fabulous, Julie Parker.
Thank you, Zach. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. How many of you were out late last night? Liars. You are all liars. I'd like to just start with a 20-second bio so you have an understanding of how I landed in law enforcement. I am not a police officer. No one wants me to be one. I started my career as a journalist and worked in Washington, D.C. as a reporter and anchor at the ABC7 affiliate in town. Covered the Beltway Sniper, the Washington Redskins, September 11th, and the usual murder and mayhem and general assignment reporting. In 2011, I joined the Prince George's County Police Department, and that's the police department that I'll be talking about today. I spent 5 years there as the first journalist who led their Media Relations Bureau. After 5 years in Prince George's, which borders the District of Columbia, I decided to slow things down a bit, and I went into the private sector for one paycheck. Someone said to me, why would you possibly think that you could go to the private world and talk about wine for a living? And I said, well, I really like wine, so I thought it would be really fun. It was really slow. So I joined the Fairfax County, Virginia Police Department in September of last year. But again, I'm going to be focusing on my previous police department and what we went through. As I look around the room, I have a sneaking suspicion that not everyone in here is a PIO. If I could get a show of hands of the PIOs who are in the room. That's interesting, because usually I'm speaking to those folks as compared to, I'm going to say we've got chiefs and folks in charge of SWAT maybe. Who's in the room? Anyone? Chiefs? Do we have chiefs? Any chiefs in here? Thank you for being here. And who else makes up this? Police officers? Commanders? Okay. I'd like to know who I'm talking to. Okay. So without further ado, We will begin what was one of the greatest tragedies that the Prince George's County Police Department had ever experienced. It was a Sunday in March, and I was home with my family getting ready to go to a friend's house for dinner. And the group text that came out to me and 7 others on the executive command staff was this. It was from our Deputy Chief of Patrol, Chris Murtha, saying a phrase that I had never heard uttered in my time with the Prince George's County Police, which was active shooter at District 3. Is anyone familiar with Prince George's County? So District 3 is one of our police stations. It's attached to headquarters. It's down the street from FedEx Field. And it's also a residential and commercial area. So think about that for a second. Officer shot. Critical. Suspect shot. Second suspect outstanding. So as the PIO who gets this group text, before I run to Twitter, which is my normal means of breaking news, I stop and think about all of the ramifications of what that group text is. And my number one question at that moment about this message, is it an active shooter as we all think about today? Is it like that horrible tragedy in Vegas? Or was it someone who was shooting and no longer is? Because there's a big difference, right? And I'm afraid to rely on a group text for such a critical piece of information. Yet at the same time, given where we are, where District 3 is, on a Sunday afternoon where officers are at work, people are going about their business. No, there was not a game, thankfully, at FedEx Field. I tried to reach Chris directly, and that's a hard thing to do in the midst of what he was dealing with. And so as I prepared to get ready to head out to the scene, which is about 50 minutes from where I live, the one thing that I regret at that moment is not putting out information that won't change. That, in fact, is my philosophy. What can you share at the moment that will not change? Will there be information in this group text that could change? Probably. We all know that, right? You've all gotten the information that started out as this and wound up as this, and you're shaking your head like, how could that have been? From a news perspective, we would get calls about a car into a building, and then find out when you get to the scene that there were a couple bricks that had fallen off the house. Things change drastically. So what I should have done is said something along the lines of getting reports of a shooting near our District 3 station, stay away. But I was waiting to get that active shooter piece from Chris. As I drive to the scene, I get him on the phone, and within 20 minutes, 15 minutes or so, we have verified that that active shooter is in fact active. This is our first tweet to share the news. And we included possible, just in case. Just in case. That stuff can change so drastically. And look how quickly on a Sunday, right after that tweet went out, that message spread. I firmly believe in using Twitter as a police department, sheriff's office, as your means of communicating with the public. There are many departments across the country where I hear from the PIOs or the chiefs who say, our city manager, our elected leader, won't let us be in charge of our social media. And I always turn to them and say, what happens if you have this on a Sunday at 5 o'clock, and now you've got to try to get in touch with the city manager or his or her PIO? Think about how long that takes. It took me about 15 minutes to get this tweet out because I wanted to verify information. Now, imagine you had to track down 1 or 2 other people and what the message, how it could get lost in translation. So if you take nothing else away from this presentation, think about that when you go back home if you're not in charge of your own social media. This saved us because how would we get that message out to the community without it? Are we going to wait for a news conference when there's an active shooter at our police station with people's homes, people driving by? Twitter is everything. And it really is a game changer for letting the community know what's happening. We kept the messages coming as we had confirmed the information. I can't emphasize that enough, how careful we were about getting it right. This is not the case where you want to rely on one person's info who may or may not have heard it correctly, who may have had a bad source. Again, we all know how that stuff happens. I always try to double source the information. That takes some time, but I think it's worth it to make sure that you've got the message that you need out there. Barlow Road is the road that intersects with Route 202, which is right where FedEx Field sits. So the very location, besides the incident itself, the very location had grabbed the attention of folks in the media world very quickly as well. We wanted to make sure that we were talking not just to the media. Sometimes it's easy to get focused on what do they need, because we work, the PIOs in this room, the chiefs, we work with the media, right? It's a different place today. But we're also talking to the folks that we serve in law enforcement. And we were very cognizant of remembering them and telling them what to do during that situation. And don't assume that it's obvious that people are just going to stay indoors. You know that there's going to be people who are curious, who want to look outside, who want to maybe get outside, who may want to take a picture of what's happening. Give them advice on what you want done. Telling people when you have the person in custody is obviously critical, and so you know what the information was that we had. It appeared that our officer was not going to make it. And as the person who's overseeing, fortunately, a team of PIOs, had a lot of help from the media standpoint and the messaging standpoint. But when you've got a situation of this magnitude, it's so much more than just the media. If you're the PIO and you're the only PIO in your department, you want to be in touch with the folks at the hospital. You need to know what's happening there. And you want to get an understanding of how your officer is doing, because people everywhere want to know. The people who live in District 3 may or may not know that officer. He or she could be the officer walking the beat. So think about how people are feeling about the news that they're hearing, and think more than just the media. It was such a relief to know that we'd gotten the second suspect in custody. The scene that day was a rainy afternoon, and the suspect had gotten a decent distance away from our headquarters, and you had reporters and police officers and SWAT team members everywhere. We took over that portion of Prince George's County. Not to mention, if you're familiar with Washington, D.C., the traffic itself, just on a regular old Sunday, is pretty insane. So we broke the news, and then we became the news. He fired one shot, wrote the Washington Post, and then he started pacing back and forth, then fired another shot, said the nurse. She added that police began pouring out of our District 3 station. Just looking outside, I'm like, oh my God, look at all of these police officers running out, putting their lives in danger. Gives me chills to read about that, to think about what those officers were getting themselves into. They had no idea. They just knew that our station and headquarters was under attack by one man firing.
Now to some breaking news out of Prince George's County, Maryland. An officer shot outside of a police station today, critically wounded. and some residents told to shelter in place. A section of the 495 Beltway closed there to traffic. Authorities confirming one suspect taken into custody. ABC's Gloria Riviera with the details coming in now. Gloria.
Good evening, Tom. What we know now, a Maryland police officer was shot and critically wounded outside Prince George's Police Headquarters. Police there urging everyone to stay inside as they canvass the area. The FBI is also on the scene. At this hour, we know that one suspect is in custody in connection with the shooting, but police remain on high alert. It is unclear if there is more than one shooter connected. We also know that more than a dozen police officers from Prince George's County are holding vigil outside the trauma center where their colleague is being treated. Tom?
We'll stay on top of this developing story throughout the broadcast. All right, Gloria, thank you.
It happened so fast. So our first tweet was at 5 o'clock, and ABC News is live with a correspondent at 6:30 that night with all of that information. Where did she get that information? Most of it. From us. We were the messenger about our news, as it should be. Right? It's our story. We want to control, to the best we can, the narrative. And how do you do that? You have to be the one getting it out there. Whatever it is, whatever means you have to do that, you don't want to wait for the media to start reporting your story if you can help it. Do you have great journalists in your various cities, towns, TV markets? No doubt. But if you control it from the beginning, it will make a difference in how your story is told. She was pulling information from our tweets. She was also relying on the ABC7 affiliate, Channel 7, who had a camera at the hospital already, 90 minutes in, to know that we had a dozen officers at that time holding vigil. Where's the media going to go? There's three places in this instance that they're going to go as this whole thing is unfolding. What's the obvious? The scene and the hospital. And the third scene is where they're getting that second suspect. But the hospital is a critical element to all of this. Think about your trauma center, where your officer would be taken, and visualize it now and put it into the perspective of, if we had some horrible tragedy like this, how will we set up? How will we stage? Where will we go? Where will the media go? These are just slight things that come into play. We knew that trauma center well. We'd had news conferences there. Reporters knew exactly where to stage themselves. They didn't really need to be guided. They found this grassy median, parked their cars away, and we will get into, over the course of this presentation, how incredibly respectful they were to our department throughout this. And there are some who say the media is terrible, they're awful, they're anti-law enforcement. We have a good relationship in Washington, D.C. Our department did with the media. And it was noteworthy how incredibly respectful they were of what we were going through, and not being pushy and me. They were very understanding of the gravity of all of this and just sort of waited for us to run things. There's the photo. So back in the day, when our department didn't have as solid a relationship with the media as it does today, and continues today in Prince George's County, there'd be a time where the inclination might be, let's keep the media away. We're dealing with something horrible. We don't really need them up in our faces right now, right? But look at that photo. How compelling is it to see that visual, and what message does it send to someone who's not in law enforcement? If your friend, your mom, your cousin sees that, there's no way to look at that and not feel something. And it's really important to allow the media to get access to that. They were not on top of the officers. They were not asking them for interviews. Like I said, respectful. They kept their distance. They followed our lead in media relations. But having them be able to get that photo and share it, I think says so much. So, you're dealing with the active shooter who thankfully is now in custody, the second suspect who's in custody, and your officer at the hospital. Our officer, unfortunately, does not make it. And you've got to be thinking about the media at a time like this, right? But you're not just thinking about the media. You're thinking about using the media to get to all of those residents in Prince George's County who your 1,300 police officers serve. Beyond Prince George's County, you're thinking about the region. Everyone knows the PGPD. And everyone is processing the fact that there was an active shooter at a police station. Where are you safe, if not at police headquarters? So we knew we wanted to talk. We wanted to get the principal stakeholders together, and we wanted to do it as soon as reasonably possible because we want to control the narrative the best we can, and we want to inform everyone who undoubtedly has a million questions. So in a situation like this, think about who you'd want to speak. Who should be at that microphone early on? So the first tweet went out at 5 p.m., and by approximately 7:30, we were holding the news conference at the hospital. So, who are your key players in an incident like this? Who needs to be at the microphone? Chief, no doubt. How about someone who knew that officer really well? Who can talk about Jakai and what he was like and what this department is dealing with? So we called upon the union president, who not only was the union president, he knew and worked well and was very close with Jakai. Our county executive, Rashern Baker, loves the PGPD. He ran with the officers. One of the officers in this room, he would go running with him. And he was really shaken up. And as the leader of the county, he wanted to be there to talk about what this county was dealing with and to extend his support for us. And then what surprised me was a fourth person who wanted to be involved in that news conference. Any idea? Part of the law enforcement family, but not, I don't think, an obvious choice. Our state's attorney stood up with us because not only are you dealing with this death of an officer, you may be at one point prosecuting this case. And she worked very closely with our police chief at all times. If we had good news about conviction in a horrible case, they'd stand up together. And if we had not so good news, where the police department got out and announced something that had gone wrong within the police department, they stood alongside each other, sending a shared message. So she was there too. The news coverage was everywhere. As you saw in the ABC story, it was everywhere, and it was everywhere quickly. And for the most part, reporters really got it right. There was not a lot of wild speculation. People did not go off the reservation. There were not a lot of crazy leaks. All of those things can happen when you're talking about a high-profile event. This was the fast food restaurant where I believe they found the second suspect. Let me point back to this for a second. In the headline, that phrase, unprovoked attack, was something that the police chief uttered. And it's in a headline because it's a powerful 2 words. You don't normally think about a police station being attacked, but that's exactly what happened that day. And the media was paying very careful attention to what we said and how we said it, and we were very cognizant of that. In this phrase, we talk about the ambush that took place at the police station. Was it an ambush? He was in a car. He was with his 2 brothers. He had talked prior to arriving to Barlow Road outside the station about basically how he wanted to die and that he was giving them his phone, his iPad passwords, and they were recording him shooting on Barlow Road at passing cars, at a passing ambulance, into the air, and then when he turned his sights on the police station and the front doors of District 3, they recorded all of that. Was it an ambush? Again, not particularly a word you're going to think of to use about an attack on a police station. We thought so. We paid a lot of attention to how we were saying what we were saying. This is probably something many of you have grappled with, is what you do in an officer-involved shooting, which is what we had, because, as I mentioned, those officers came rushing out of our District 3 station. A number of officers came rushing out of the station. The officer who was shot, Jakai, was an undercover narcotics officer who was coming to District 3 to bring a meal to a friend. And that friend called and tried to warn him, something's happening, don't come. He did anyway. And he was in plain clothes, and he was in a civilian car. And he rolled up as the shots are being fired at our station. And what does he do? He's a police officer. He gets out, and he goes to engage the suspect. But he's wearing everyday clothes. And the officers who are pouring out of the station see 2 men shooting, right? And then they see Jakai turning to run away. And we think that Jakai knew he was in a tough situation and was going to get cover. But our officer didn't know that. And so he shot at what he thought was one of the suspects, fatally wounding our officer. Normally in Prince George's County, if there's an officer-involved shooting, within 24 hours of that incident, we would release officers' names. It had been standard operating procedure. Well, what about this case? For the chiefs in the room, do you veer from your normal protocol when you have a situation like this? When you have 6 officers involved, one of them being Jakai, 4 being officers who fired their weapons, and 1 being an officer who was right there in it but did not. So you've got a total of 6 police officers. What do you do with their names in a situation like this? What we opted to do was stick with our protocol, which is to release the involved officer's name. And in this case, what we did that veered a bit was release the names of all 6 officers. So it was Jakai's name as part of the group. It was the officer who fired the fatal shot. And it was 3 other officers and then another one who was at the scene, right there with them. And we felt that that sufficed for sharing information about the officers. Would anyone in the room think we should highlight the officer who fired the fatal shot? Okay. Our second blog went out the next day. And we painted the story about what occurred with these 3 brothers, 2 of whom were recording the entire incident. And we talk about Jakai as our dedicated officer, because that's what he was. Think about your words, and think about the message that you send when you're narrating your story. Dedicated officer killed after gunman opens fire.
We begin with breaking news. Moments ago, Prince George's County Police announced a 3rd suspect is now in custody for the ambush killing of a police officer. WJZ investigator Mike Halgren is live following these new developments. Mike.
Lynn, 3 brothers are in custody. Sources say this was a domestic dispute, and police now confirm that the gunman wanted to die in a shootout with police. Prince George's County Officer Jakai Colson is the 5th member of law enforcement murdered in our region in less than 5 weeks. He would have turned 29 this week. Now, 2 suspects are in custody in his killing. The chief says Colson, who was an undercover narcotics officer, was gunned down at the police station next door to county police headquarters.
An individual launched an unprovoked attack on the District's 3 police station and brought several of our officers under fire. Those officers did not shrink. They bravely advanced and engaged this individual who was threatening not just the police officers in the police facility that he was opening fire upon, but numerous members of the community in the area.
The suspects have yet to be identified. One was injured in the shootout. Outside the hospital, WJZ spoke to a woman who says she's their aunt.
Why did all of this happen? What caused this? We don't know. What triggered this? We don't know. We had never had nothing like this happen in our family.
The head of the police union says Officer Colson never shied away from high-risk work.
This is a police family that is truly, truly grieving right now. But the community as a whole should join us in that grieving and stand up and acknowledge that this type of attack, this type of behavior is not warranted and it is unacceptable.
Colson was shot around 4:30 yesterday afternoon, and in the chaos that followed, police ordered hundreds who live in the area to shelter in place for roughly 3 hours. Now, as they mourn, they're also building their case to bring justice for Officer Colson.
Murder is a crime against our entire community, and not only that, but murder is the highest crime against humanity, and that's how we will treat it.
So, again, 3 brothers now in custody, and the gunman's motive, according to police, is that he wanted to die in a shootout. The governor has ordered flags to fly at half-staff statewide. Lynn?
Mike, thank you. Last month, Harford County Sheriff's deputies Mark Logsdon and Pat Daly died in the line of duty. So did Prince William County Officer Ashley Gwindon.
A couple of things about that story. Not sure where that domestic dispute came from. The only time we ever heard it. Sometimes that happens in a newsroom. We didn't address it. We didn't have time to address it. But noteworthy that it didn't catch on. What about the chief's remarks? He's a gifted speaker. And remember the unprovoked attack that I mentioned? When you work in public information and you hear a chief who can speak like that and you hear him say something like that, grab it and use it again. Reinforce that message when it's as strong as that one was. You saw the union president there. You saw the state's attorney there. And initially, I'll be honest, when I heard that she was coming to the scene, I was a little surprised, confused maybe, wasn't sure what her messaging would be at that particular time. But again, she worked so closely with us. She cared about this. At that point, that night, at that news conference, there could be a criminal prosecution of someone. Everything wasn't quite yet sorted out. I think it worked. This was one of the greater challenges of this horrible tragedy. These are Jakai's parents. And when I say our department embraced them, figuratively and literally embraced this family. They had so many levels of grief to deal with once we had verified, to the best that we could early on, that this was in fact a blue-on-blue death. And if you are those parents, your reaction could be a few things when that happens. And I think everyone would understand if their reaction to us, the department, was extreme anger, right? It was not. They were with us. The chief brought them in. The chief was with them at the hospital. They held meetings in his office together, members of the executive command staff. I was hugging these people. They were part of the police family, and that police family that you hear about, we saw it in action, and the support that we gave to this grieving family. And so the question became, when we're doing a news conference, from a media perspective, I know that reporters are going to try to get to the family. In some cases, the family wants to talk. Sometimes that surprises folks in law enforcement. Sometimes a family, it's a cathartic thing for them to talk about what just occurred, to talk about Jakai's life and what he was like and how he always wanted to be a police officer. And that was the case with this couple. Not right away, but they wanted to be at that news conferences, vigil. They wanted to be there with us. And so his mom, who I think this picture just captures it so well, his mom was devastated. And she wanted to be up in front of the cameras. And I had suggested maybe at the news conference, you both just sit right in the front row. I was worried she was going to collapse up there. She was so fragile. She wanted to be there, and she was surrounded by our police leaders and police officers. And they didn't talk initially, and they didn't need to, because look at their faces. But we included them because they wanted to be a part of it.
Next from Maryland tonight, new details about a chaotic gun battle right outside a police station. We reported earlier this week that Officer Jakai Colson, undercover and out of uniform at the time, was reportedly killed by friendly fire. Well, tonight the police chief now saying the preliminary investigation reveals what they feared, that it was a fellow officer who shot him. Here's ABC senior justice correspondent Pierre Thomas now.
The tragic death of Detective Jakai Colson has shaken the Prince George's County Police Department to its core. Today, the fears that a fellow officer was responsible were confirmed. Police say one of Colson's colleagues shot him because he perceived a threat, apparently thinking Colson was one of the suspects.
The shot that struck and killed Detective Colson was deliberately aimed at him by another police officer. There's no intention, as I have seen the facts, to indicate any malice.
Colson, in plain clothes and an unmarked car, was killed during an exchange of gunfire when police responded to the attack. On Monday, I asked the chief about the pain of knowing that one of his own officers may have mistakenly shot another.
You struck another defender down? That's particularly devastating.
Police must now resolve critical questions, including how and why this mistake was made and how tragedies like this can be prevented in the future. David?
Pierre Thomas in Washington tonight. Pierre, thank you.
A couple of things about this video. One, did you hear a word from the police chief that stuck out to you? I had never heard a police officer described as a defender, but I thought it was an awesome word. And he has that gift as a chief to talk like that. I didn't give him those notes. That's just him. So when you have that, when you have a gem like that on your department, whether they're okay with the media or not, try to nurture that and bring them out as a powerful voice in law enforcement, like this chief was throughout this process. Another noteworthy point about this video, a year before, ABC News producer, I don't even remember her name now, called our media relations office and said, hey, we'd like to have a meeting with you guys. We want to work more closely with local law enforcement. And despite the fact that I came from the media world and I'm progressive media relations, I was like, why is she calling? Is there some sort of ulterior motive to this? We don't really work with national news. We have DC media, they cover us, and the DC media shoots the story, and then national news will pick it up if they want it. So I held the meeting with her, sort of looked at her sideways, and the meeting was what she said it was. We just want to get to know you guys in the event that something happens. Well, a year later, something happened. And while I had not met Pierre at that meeting, I just worked with his producer, she called me a couple of days into this and said, I'd like to get the chief one-on-one with Pierre. And we tried to work that out because, as you've seen, if you held my job and you had this chief, you'd want him on ABC News too. Given everything that was going on, we actually couldn't coordinate the timing, but we tried. Pierre did a version of the story at 6:30 on the East Coast, and there was one mistake in it. I can't recall specifically what it was. It wasn't monumental, but it was worth a phone call. Called the producer. She had it fixed quickly. Pierre emailed me to apologize for the mistake, and they fixed it for the West Coast. And I use that point to show the power of media relations. Take the meeting if you get the call. Get to know people. You think, when am I ever going to work with these people? Really, no harm can come from it, and only good can, generally. Back to that name release plan. So, as it often does, the name of the officer who fired that shot got out. Our department was 2,200 people, 1,300 officers. Many reporters in DC had covered our department for 20, 25, almost 30 years. People know people, and people talk. But despite the fact that a couple of our beat reporters had that officer's name, they didn't do anything with it. Another example of the respect. Was it necessary? Was it necessary to put out that officer's name? These are debates we had at the highest level. Across county government. It's not necessarily just a police matter anymore. There are people who have vested interests in your police department and in a situation like this, and when a name release is a topic that's going on across the country, people are weighing in. So while we debated it, we didn't do anything outside of what we had done, because remember, 24 hours after the incident, we had put out the names of all of the involved officers, to include the officer. What I did was ensure that the commanders of that officer who had fired the shot was aware, that the commanders were aware, that the name was out there but not being published, not being reported, and that he had to prepare just in case. And he knew that. He knew there was a possibility in some way, shape, or form, if not the department, his name could get out there. And so he began to process what that would look like for him. So the police department, didn't release it. But guess who did? Not the reporters. It came out in court during a preliminary hearing when an attorney said it. So then what? The chief, after the hearing, got out and acknowledged what was out there and talked about, with sensitivity, what that officer was dealing with. And everyone, whether you're in law enforcement or not, can appreciate, not to the same degree as the folks in this audience, but everyone can appreciate how horrible that had to be. And so the chief addressed it head on. And then it was out there. But was it a big deal in terms of media coverage? No. Again, the respect was there. So what's the tone like during a tragedy like this? And what does it feel like as a police department to be going through this? How can you share that with the media, with the public? It was phenomenal the way Prince George's County was, and beyond, was responding to our department. Because you saw in that Baltimore news report that 5 officers in, I believe, 5 weeks had been killed in the line of duty in the general area of Maryland, DC, and Virginia. Phenomenally awful. So we shared images. We thanked people for coming forward. We did whatever we could and sprinkled it into news conferences talking about that support. Don't just assume, well, of course everyone's supporting us. In 2017, it's worth taking the time to point out how much support we're getting right now. And think about your media strategy, because what if our media was not being respectful to our department? Think about just that one piece alone, how you'd have to think about your strategy and how you did things and whether or not you made your chief available to ABC News or not. You got to read the room, basically, and then adjust your communications plan accordingly. We very much involved our community, and the chief wanted to hold a vigil, a candlelight vigil, 1 week later at the time that the shots were fired. And there were a number of things going through our head about doing that in the parking lot where our officers ran out into to shoot at Michael Ford. One, is this safe? You know, these are 3 brothers who are from the community. What might that look like? Who is going to turn out? How are they going to be when they turn out? This wasn't a let's hold a a vigil to get the media there. Trust me, we did not need any more media coverage. But they came out in droves, and so did the community. They were spilling onto Barlow Road from our parking lot, the same road where the shots were being fired from. And Jakai's grandmother was there in a wheelchair, and multiple times throughout that hour-long vigil or so, the chief was leaning over her, whispering in her ear. It was real and heartfelt, and another example of that family being a part of our police department's family. If you can look closely on the right-hand side in the middle, and then on the bottom, underneath the sign, what do you see? Bullet holes from the shooter. So that's through the glass front door of the District 3 station, and now you're in the lobby of our heavy doors leading inside the station. That's where those bullets landed. And the chief had that sign created and put up there as a reminder to everyone who walks through those doors what occurred that day in March. We shared it on social media, and the community responded. We were letting them in on something very personal, but it's their police station too. It was our mission to inform the public and the media quickly, accurately, and meaningfully. We were very cognizant of our words and how we were sharing this awful tragedy. And a photo like this is something we also shared. That mourning badge.
Now it's my sad duty to have to share with you that circumstantially, we believe the fired round that led to Detective Colson's death was fired by one of his fellow Prince George's County police officers reacting to this. The shot that struck and killed Detective Colson was deliberately aimed at him by another police officer.
I specifically left a lot of time so that we could talk about the messaging in this, the media in this, and if you've experienced something like this on your departments, and if you found that it went as well as it could have, or perhaps that it went awry, so that we could talk about it. How many in this room have experienced a line of duty death? It's actually fewer than I thought. And was the media component for you challenging? What about it?
You kind of want to be separate from the media because even though you may have a positive relationship with the media, it's a moment where the agency wants to really close
if you could hear okay, it's a time where we want to be alone. We don't want to deal with the media right now. And I get it. It makes sense. But do you see the value in allowing them in and allowing them to get close? And just think about that picture at the hospital. Ma'am? So the question is, how long did we know that it was friendly fire? Well, it's a police department, and it's a big one, and the talk happened quickly. I think the chiefs and the deputy chiefs knew very early on. I didn't start hearing about it until the hospital. And from a media person's perspective, how do you begin to process the active shooter, your officer killed, and now it's that component, and what are you doing about that component and when? It was so much to process. We naturally needed to understand for sure that that is what occurred. But the reason that we felt as confident as we could without ballistic evidence at the moment was that Jakai was killed by a rifle round, and one of our officers had a rifle. No indication that Ford had anything but a handgun, but we didn't know for sure. And we were trying to almost take this multi-layered tragedy a piece or two at a time. So it was on Monday when the news started coming out, and we essentially, without ballistic evidence, without 100% assurance, by Tuesday, we're saying that we believed it to be. Any other questions about the messaging that you heard from the chief or from us, sir? Thank you. Okay. So the timeline of the name piece is within 24 hours, you've got all of the involved officers out there for the public. Maybe 2 or so days after that release is out, we're hearing rumblings from two of our beat reporters, hey, we have the name. Just sort of a heads up, like, we've got it. And I said, okay. And that was the conversation. There was no, what are you going to do about it? They were just letting me know they had it.
So they didn't say, we know that it is John Smith who fired the fatal round. They just were putting rumors out there, saying that they, telling you they knew, but they didn't say the name.
No, they said the name to me, and it was the name. And I said, okay. Talk to you later. Now, they were reporters who I worked very closely with. They certainly could have said, I have the name, and I'm putting it out at 6. They didn't even ask. So I just took note. Okay. I made sure the chief knew that some reporters had it and knew, and the chief also had a good relationship with these reporters. And as I said, those discussions just kept taking place at the highest levels of our county government. What are we going to do about that name or not? Until it was out of our hands, which as a media person makes me a little crazy because we're not in charge of the narrative anymore. Someone else, an attorney, just took charge of our story. And now we are being reactive to what occurred rather than being proactive. Well, if we had been proactive, we're now using the name of this officer. So it was a very challenging situation, and we just had to roll with it once it came out. But thank you. Thanks. Other questions? You, sir?
Were any officers hit by the offender?
No. No. Ma'am? When I last worked there, he had returned to duty. Ma'am?
How did you work with the department to share your messaging internal so the other officers?
Great question. Great question. So, as anyone in this room knows, internal communications sometimes is our weakest attribute. And in this case, at the hospital, we began developing the first internal message. And truly, from a media perspective, I was too overwhelmed to be in charge of internal communications at that point. And so the chief relied upon his chief of staff and one of his majors to formulate what the initial message would be, all the while being cognizant that anything we wrote in that email could come out, being prepared for something to go public. Not that it necessarily would, but you've got to be ready for it. And so having the chief of staff and that major write the email was important. I'm not a police officer. I work in law enforcement, I work in communications, but it's different. I would not want to be responsible for that message to all of our officers. And so I appreciated that they did that. And then we were cognizant throughout the process of, as the big monumental pieces occurred publicly, like the friendly fire piece where we were acknowledging it, that we addressed our department first before it was on ABC News or we tweeted about something. Great question. Sir?
How was dealing with Jakai's family, his mother and father, given this enormous tragedy and the need for some of this information for various reasons to get out?
How was dealing with the family? They were as kind and loving and supportive of the department as you could imagine. For example, at the funeral home, they had probably 24 of our command staff and Jakai's narcotics colleagues in the little room to the side with them, with grandmothers and aunts and cousins and his brother all together. And they actually relied upon the Media Relations Bureau at the scene of the funeral home because they wanted to speak. And they wanted Jakai's brother to be out there alongside them as they talked to reporters. So we worked very closely with them, and we were so fortunate that was their feeling about our department.
And as incomprehensible as it must be for a family dealing with this under the circumstances, was it difficult? Were you able to use the family to help the other officers deal in this process?
Meaning, did the officer who fired the fatal shot connect with the family? I'm sure, based on what I know of how this all played out, that occurred, but I don't specifically know or recall how those two connected.
This is a tragedy, and I'm sure most of
I looked at that police chief many times, particularly at the hospital, thinking, how are you able to deal with all of these different elements of tragedy right now and remain as composed as you are? I've never seen so many big, burly, undercover men breaking down in tears. It was horrible. It was just horrible to experience. He led them in prayer in the hospital lobby at one point the night of. And before, in fact, we went to that news conference, he gathered there were hundreds of people at Shock Trauma, and he gathered them together, all of us, and people just stood together and cried, and then went out and did the news conference. Sir?
I ask this with the greatest amount of respect. Was there policy in place in terms of the UC officer responding to the scene and showing up with UC gear, or did he not have information? I'm a little confused as to whether he was a part of this agency and didn't hear the radio traffic and didn't know what he was getting into.
He was part of our agency. He was an undercover officer. To my understanding, there was not a UC policy on whether a badge, band, or anything to that effect. He was on his way to headquarters to drop off a meal to a friend, and that friend called and warned him and said, there's something happening, don't come. But he did. And as he pulled up, he saw the shooter firing at the station. Thank you very much. I'll be here. There are cards up here if you want to talk. Thank you.